Andy is the most goblin/kobold person I have ever found on the internet. And not in like the way that goblin has been addressed in things, but just like the ravenous, horrid hyena little man.
Yeah.
I've lost some games to extraordinarily bad beats that I'm now going to whine about on the podcast. My opponent was at 6. I have Krark the Thumbless in play. I have 4 red mana available. I draw Chain Lightning.
That sounds perfect.
I say, perfect, can't lose. Now, this Chain Lightning actually kills my opponent instead of just putting them to 3. I have to figure stuff. Like, if I didn't have Krark, I'd have to remove something in play and try and attack for more damage. But I have Krark. I'm like, this is great. I just got to win 1 out of 4 flips, which, if you crunch the numbers, is like a 94% chance you're going to win 1 out of 4 flips. Listener, let me tell you, I cast it, bounced, cast it, bounced, cast it, bounced, cast it, and bounced again. Then my opponent thought seized it, and I lost the game. And I...
Oh my God, Andy.
Have you been caught?
Please calm down. No. Andy, please calm down. Kind of just, he's got that energy where he needs to be soothed.
Yeah.
Aggressively soothed.
Andy has the vibe of someone who's just been let out of his thunder jacket.
Yeah. I feel like Andy probably has a lot of bullet holes in his roof.
Yeah, we've been putting progressively heavier and heavier weighted blankets on Andy.
Yeah.
And when you know it, every day, no matter how heavy. We're up to 1,500 kilos of weighted blanket at this point.
Well, we got to keep an eye on Andy. Okay, can you bookmark him or something?
Oh, babe, he's bookmarked.
Okay.
Not good?
Sounds good.
Great. Well, then welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, normal coffee enjoyer, Maddox.
I know you're a fan of weird coffee, so that makes me the normal coffee guy.
No, I don't enjoy coffee. I bring this up as a nickname today because I had tea for the first time today in a long time. I avoid caffeine. I have a lot of natural energy. I have a lot of sleeping problems, and so caffeine and I are not friends. Today I was like, I'm having some tea. I made it a little strong, and it's 8 hours later, and I'm still really tweaked because of it. So I've got a lot of energy I'm bringing to the table today.
All right, great. Let's do it. Let's do a really fast episode. I had some tea today, too, after I had my coffee. So I'm in the same boat. I have my baseline as 1 coffee a day, except on weekends. I'll usually have 2. But then, yeah, I went for some tea as well. So let's get
You have
amped.
more on weekends than you do on weekdays.
Correct.
Is that normal? I genuinely don't know because I'm not a coffee drinker.
I mean, so on a Friday, Saturday night, I'm not worried about making sure I get to sleep right on time. So I'll have a little more coffee.
That makes sense.
Have a good time.
Well, people can play this episode at like half speed instead of 1.5 speed if they want to hear us talk at a normal speed, because we have a lot to cover in this episode, and we are both caffeined up. This is our Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Mechanics and Themes episode. So this is the first of our 3-part set review episode structure. So we're going to have this episode where we're going to talk explicitly about the themes, mechanics, the nature of the set, and from a design perspective primarily. So we're not going to be talking about specific cards. We're not going to be doing power level evaluations. We are just going to be talking about these themes, how they behave, the pros and cons of them in terms of play patterns, and what kinds of cubes or other kinds of environments might be looking for more of these kinds of effects. Our next episode in our review series is going to be our personal cube editions, where we're going to talk about the cards in each of our specific contexts we're interested in testing. Then, once we get the results of our survey back, our 3rd episode in this series will be the Cube Community Set Review, where we talk about how these cards were broadly received by cube designers of all stripes. The whole set is not spoiled yet, so our survey is not yet out at the time of recording, and I don't think it'll be out at the time this episode comes out, but maybe check to see if it is.
I'm ready to hit the button as soon as the full set is up on Scryfall.
Right, we are just waiting for all the cards to be spoiled and for Scryfall to add them all to their database, and then we can put the survey live, so I don't check up on that maybe, but it should definitely be up by the time we record next week's episode, and so we will definitely talk about it there. We talked a little bit on past episodes about how you were tentatively excited about Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. You have a deep place in your heart for cyberpunk and sci-fi themes, but you wanted to make sure that it was done right. Now we've seen, I don't know, probably a third of the set or something at time of recording. How are you feeling about these cards?
I feel pretty good about it. I mean, I'll say that, it's not like them making more stuff is going to negatively impact my impression of cyberpunk as a theme or even Kamigawa. But I was definitely thinking like, this might be for me. This could really be for me. Some of my favorite things. I love Neuromancer and Snow Crash and all these other sort of similar things that have this awesome, like futuristic, magical vibe.
Probably stuff that was on their mood board when they were designing Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, somewhere in the depths of R&D, I imagine.
Diamond Age. I got to mention Diamond Age. That's maybe not quite cyberpunk, but it's just this awesome like tech vibe is really appealing to me in fiction. So I was thinking this could be for me, or we could have another Mandelbrot set with googly eyes situation. And overall, I'm pretty impressed with the whole theme, the art style, and especially a lot of the mechanics I think are really interesting and lean into sort of the style of what like futuristic technology means.
Yeah, I'm overall excited about it too. I will say that a lot of the cards in their art don't actually have any like cyberness to them. There's a lot of cards that kind of could flavor and art-wise just be from original Kamigawa, and then there's like a whole other set of cards that are much more cyber-inspired.
Definitely. I mean, the whole set is sort of designed around that duality and the fact that there is this cyber technology side of Kamigawa, but there's also this side that is much more traditional and based on nature and traditions. And the fact that those two worlds are sort of coming together is really what the theme of this set is all about.
How far are you from reading the Magic fiction?
I've never considered it for past sets, but I do really enjoy the Good Luck Hi-Fi recaps of it. And and a lot of people have really talked up the story for this set. So this might be the first one I dig into.
I should check out the recaps because I am very far from reading any Magic fiction because I'm pretty far from reading any normal fiction, as we discussed in this show before anyway. So pretty far down my list. But those recaps sound like very appealing things to me maybe. So I will check those out. We'll link them in show notes.
Yeah, it's nice to have just a little bit of a high-level overview because the story really does come through in a lot of cards. Like that's something that they work very hard to do when they're designing a set.
Yeah.
And having just a little bit of context really helps you sort of tie those points together.
All right, let's dally no further. Is that the phrase? Tally?
Terry?
Terry. Let us tarry no further and dive right into Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Now, Anthony, I know that you care about talking about the really high-level themes of the set, even more so than some of the actual named mechanics.
Yeah, I mean, the named mechanics are obviously important. It's sort of the easiest hooks and entry point into breaking down a set. But in reality, when they're designing sets, it's really based on a collection of themes, and whether something gets keyworded or not is kind of more of like a detail at the end of the set almost, and how they present it. But there's a lot more going on here than just the named mechanics. High level, I think that the big story, the big headline for this set is it is all about artifacts and enchantments, which is, I think, something that's really...
And kind of combining them in a novel way.
Yeah, so we see a lot of cards that are actually batching those two types together and saying, well, if you have both artifacts and enchantments, you get some reward, as well as just a lot of really novel ways to get more artifacts and enchantments into your deck, including both artifact and enchantment creatures in high densities. And I think that's going to be really appealing to a lot of cube designers that are either specifically building artifact and enchantment themes, or like cubes that are entirely based around those themes, or people that just have, a more diverse cube where they're looking to support some of these themes a little bit more.
Yeah, and that high-level theme, obviously, is right in line with that summary of the story, right? We have the old world traditional magical Kamigawa being combined with the new world technological Kamigawa in the enchantments and artifacts, respectively. So that makes a lot of sense.
Really ties the room together.
The next big theme in this set that's not a named mechanic per se, or at least is an evergreen mechanic that is showing up in higher density here, is vehicles. We see a lot of vehicles in this set, and a few of them taking very different approaches to what a vehicle can be. Have we spoken about vehicles before, Anthony? How do you feel about vehicles in Magic?
I think it's a cool thing. Honestly, I think it's a very good solution to an interesting top-down design challenge. I know that they had tried to design vehicles many, many times, and this idea of having this crew cost, I think, is a really cool way. And I honestly just aesthetically like the idea of here's a card that's got power and toughness, but it's not a creature. Like, we'll figure out what that means. And I think that
confused.
They're really pushing the space that vehicles can occupy with this set. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, to me, when I think about them from a like game design perspective, especially relative to my own cube environments, they occupy a very similar space to me to like equipment and other kinds of ways to modify creatures. This little call forward is what they call that. Because what they do is they allow you to use creatures in other ways, right? To turn an otherwise small creature into something that's relevant in the late game. The same way that putting an equipment on it might do that. Obviously, the actual mechanics of how they interact is different, right? You get to swing with the vehicle, even if your creature just came into play and is summoning sick, which is kind of a cool thing that you can't do with equipment. Obviously, you have to continue to recrew it, but crewing doesn't usually cost mana, so it's a very different relationship between these cards, but they fall into this kind of like supplemental category where it's like, these are not my actual threats, but these can like supplement my threats and give some of them late game value and relevance, which I appreciate because I don't like drawing dead cards.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I really love mechanics that let you use your resources in different ways or turn some component of the game into a resource that wouldn't previously, and giving you that late game flexibility of now these 1/1 tokens are relevant again, I think really opens up a lot of interesting games. And there's sort of that complicated situation of it not always being a creature, so only certain cards can interact with it at certain times. Again, just like opens up really interesting decision space and new kinds of risk of when do you want to crew and block with your vehicle and things like that.
Right. If you're the beatdown, then your vehicle is pretty safe from sorcery speed removal because you're going to be attacking with it. And so you don't have to worry about it dying your sorcery speed removal or board wipes. So Yeah, I think vehicles are cool. I'm excited to see more. To talk about power briefly, when it comes to power-motivated cubes, we were trying to design at the peaks of magic power, we have this pattern with vehicles that we also have with equipment, to be frank, where some of the first ones were extra pushed, either because they did so intentionally to make the mechanic really pop and get people to actually play with the cards, or because they hadn't really learned how to balance them yet. And so I think when we return to something like vehicles, I think we're unlikely to get something like a smuggler's copter, for example. The same way when we return to equipment, we're unlikely to get another skull clamp or an Umezawa's Jite or whatever. But of course, that still leaves plenty of much more reasonable power level design space to be explored.
Right. Something else that we'll see a ton of in the set is colored artifacts, specifically because of that challenge of if they push an artifact a little bit too far and it has a generic mana cost,
everyone
can play it. So it can really sort of dominate and shape a format in a way that doesn't create the diversity that they're really looking for. So we're seeing more and more, and I think we're going to see a lot here of colored artifacts.
All right, let's dive into the actual named mechanics of this set. We're going to go over them in the order that they were listed in the Wizards of the Coast Mechanics of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty preview article, which we will also link in the show notes. And that means the first one, Anthony, is Reconfigure. This is an ability that appears on cards that are both creatures and equipment. Cards that have both creature types and equipment types.
Right. It doesn't appear on creatures and also equipments. It appears on creature equipments.
Only creature equipments. And they enter as creatures and have this Reconfigure ability, which is kind of an alternative to an equip cost. They do not have equip. They have Reconfigure instead. And what Reconfigure does is when you pay the Reconfigure cost, you either attach it to a creature, just like equip, or you can unattach it completely, which is something that maybe people that haven't played a bunch with equipment are aware of. If you have an equipment attached to a creature, you can't just choose to unattach that equipment. You have to move it to another creature to get it off of the creature that it's on. So Reconfigure kind of gets around that and says, if you want to just unattach this and turn it back into a creature, you can.
I'll never forget the first time in a Commander game, I was like, I target my thing with Lightning Greaves. My opponent's like, you can't do that. It has Shroud. And I'm like, oh, well, I'll unequip Lightning Greaves for 0. And they didn't let me do it. It was very sad.
Rude. And the other important thing to note about the actual rules of Reconfigure here is that whenever the equipment becomes unattached from whatever creature it's attached to, it just becomes a creature again. So if you have played this creature equipment out, paid the Reconfigure cost to attach it to another creature, and then that other creature is removed, or there's a board wipe or something, then you get that creature back that was part of the original Reconfigure spell.
And it's worth mentioning that all of these, we have a bunch of different creatures with Reconfigure. They all basically just grant their own abilities to the creature they're attached to. So if it's a 2/2...
Not all of them.
Oh, is that?
Yeah, there's that black rare one that is a 3/2 or 3/1 that gives +5/+5 when you reconfigure it.
Well, most of them, especially at the lower rarities, grant their own abilities. So if it's a 1/1, it'll grant 1/1 to the creature. If it's a 2/2 with double strike, it'll give 2/2 with double strike. What do you think about this mechanic?
I like it a lot. I mean, this is a mechanic that is modal, right? These are cards that can do two different things. It's a mechanic that allows us to, as we've talked about before, with living weapon cards and cards that have a living weapon-esque ability like Ancestral Blade or the Thopter one that you're going to say right now.
Barbed Spike.
Thank you. These cards that allow you to get more equipment into your deck and cube for Equipment Matters themes without diluting the density of threats, right? Because all of these equipments are also creatures in your deck, which means that you're not going to have that situation where you run out of things to equip your equipment to and you do all equipment. So I really like it for the fact that it's modal and allows you to, again, get a higher density of these effects without giving up threat density.
I think we've said with literally every single set for the last, well, as long as we've been saying anything on this podcast, that here's another sort of twist in a mechanic that allows you to do that, to get more density of equipment in your deck without just increasing that risk of I draw my equipment but not my creatures. I'm looking at this mechanic and I'm wondering, have they gone a little bit too far? Like, there's really no downside to these. They're great when they're equipment, but you just get a whole creature when you have the creature side. I feel a little bit like that loss of tension and that loss of risk is maybe a little bit too pushed here. At the same time, like, if I just change the way I'm thinking about it and not think of, oh, this is an improved or, a powered up version of Equip, if instead you thought of this like Soul Bond or some other mechanic like that, I like it from that perspective. So I don't know.
If you're just going to argue with yourself, then I have no need
yeah,
here. You're going to give both sides of the argument. I'm very good at arguing,
on one side of the table with myself. It's a feature. I think I like it overall. I especially appreciate that it has modality, but it's not just like a card that has a menu and says either do A or B. You make the choice once, and the card does two different things. Like, there's a ton of decision space in when do you cast this? Are you planning to cast this as a 3-drop when you want to play it and equip right away? Are you actually going to be moving it between creatures over the course of multiple turns? So I like that kind of modality that plays out over the course of multiple turns a lot more.
Yeah, it is a modal card, but it is modal in a different way, right? Because you always have to do mode A first, and then you can do mode B in different ways if you want. And that kind of makes a pseudo mode C, right?
Right. I mean, depending on how you frame it, I think you can also, like, players will shortcut this to say, I want to do this on turn 3 and be able to activate and cast the same time and just sort of shortcut it into this is my one action for the turn.
Right. To go back to your feeling that maybe they've gone too far and made equipment too safe and taken away some of that risk.
Too safe. That's a good way to describe it, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that's actually a factor of the design of the mechanic. I think it's more a factor of the balance, right? Because you said, what is the downside here? And theoretically, the downside should be the cost. Like, both sides of this, because it gives you both sides, should be a little less efficient than either side independently, right? I expect most of these creatures to be a little bit overcosted, where they're going to cost a little more for their actual body or board impact. I expect the reconfigure abilities to be a little overcosted relative to a similar equipment's equipability. And for that, you get the flexibility of being able to do one or either. You get the flexibility of when your creature's removed, you get that creature back. And so I think really it comes down to how these cards are actually developed to determine whether or not they've made a couple that are like too safe, right? I still, as a very conservative player, am going to hesitate to actually use the reconfigure ability, right? That's going to be, for me, kind of like a last-ditch effort, because even though you do get to keep that creature if they remove the target in response to the reconfigure ability, that's still a bunch of mana that you spent to do essentially nothing. And so it's not as bad as having, your GTA in play and you go to equip it and your thing gets removed and now you have no GTA on a creature and no creatures left. That's like worst case scenario for equipment. But it is still pretty bad, I think, to, dump 3, 4, even more mana into a reconfigure ability only to have that entire ability basically fizzled by a removal spell. So I think the risk is still there, but it's a little more balanced than it is with auras or just pure straight up equipment where you gotta pay to cast it, pay to equip before you get any effect out of that equipment, and one removal spell sets you back however many mana to that before you have to do it again.
How do you feel about the flavor of this mechanic?
I like the flavor of the mechanic. It definitely has a very cyberpunk feel, right?
Yeah.
Like, you've got these, I picture license, right? License are these enchantment creatures from History of Magic that could turn from creatures into auras attached to creatures. And so there's a similarity there. But I also think of those weird body augmenting machines from the Matrix where it kind of latches onto you and then gives you this augmentation. I think it has a very cool cyberpunk sci-fi feel to it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I especially like the reality chip. So it's 2 mana for an 0/4. You can look at the top card of your library at any time, and if it's reconfigured onto something, then you can cast those spells. And I just love that flavor of, I have the reality chip, I can see in the future and predict things, but if I actually plug the reality chip into myself, I actually have the power to access those.
I want to mention a couple cool play patterns here. One that I think is really interesting is that because you can just pay to unattach it, you can imagine a board state where you reconfigure your creature as an equipment onto one of your other creatures. You attack as a big creature with, this big giant monster. And then second main phase, you just unattach
tap your creature very carefully.
And then second main phase, you just unattach it. And now that equipment, which just essentially attacked, the power and toughness that was granted by your reconfigure card got to attack. And now when you unattach it, you still have that power and toughness back on defense to block, which I think is a very cool little play pattern that people should be aware of.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I love those kinds of effects where you didn't have to write all those words on this card and make the mechanic read in a super confusing way to open up a lot of interesting play space like that.
The other thing I'll say is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Anthony, maybe I'm reaching a little bit, because I know that fun is subjective. Everyone can find different things fun. I think there's something inherently fun about making a big Voltron-y creature, suiting a creature up and attacking with it. And so as somebody who avoids a lot of cards that do that, because a lot of them are inherently very risky. When you start talking about big expensive equipment, when you start talking about expensive auras, they're really risky in the face of instant speed removal, and I run a lot of that in my own cube environments. So as someone that doesn't like that, I still find that very cool, and I'm grateful for any opportunity I have to play cards that maybe are a little bit safer, to your point, and maybe take a little bit of that risk away, but still allow me to, in some circumstances, make my big giant creature and get my attacks in. We've talked before about how I think it's cards that allow you to, in combination with other cards, create a third new kind of thing. For example, augmenting power and toughness here could do different things depending on what card you attach it to, right? You can reconfigure onto a flyer, and now you have evasive power and toughness. You can reconfigure onto a Dreadhorde Arcanist, and then flashback a 5-mana spell when you attack with your reconfigured Dreadhorde Arcanist. So you can do a lot of different things with these abilities, which means they're going to play out differently in different board states and different decks.
Totally. The only other thing I would say about this reconfigure and this whole set in general is this set has some of the wildest type lines we have seen in a long time, and these are no exception.
I feel like someone says that almost every set spoiler, though.
Do I say this every set spoiler?
You don't.
I'm saving it for this one.
The next mechanic, I would say, is pretty closely tied to reconfigure, and that is modified. Modified is a new game term that encompasses all creatures you control that are equipped enchanted by an aura you control, or have counters of any kind on them. So this is a new word that basically is a bucket to contain other things that already exist in Magic. I think its closest sibling in recent history is historic spells, where we got a new term historic that referred to artifact and legendary spells and sagas in Dominaria. Here we have a new term that refers to creatures that are modified in specific ways. It doesn't matter what kind of counter it is. It only counts your own auras. So if your opponent puts a pacifism on your creature, that doesn't count as being modified. And the cards that care about modified care about it in many different ways. So some things are triggers, some things are static abilities, some things just get better when you have a modified creature or whatever. I think this is a brilliant way to connect something that to me feels, as a player, very similar. Like it feels like it's pretty similar to have an aura or an equipment on a creature, right? It's another card that I put behind it on the battlefield that changes the attributes of that base creature. Counters are a little bit different, but still similar. We're changing the attributes of that base creature. I feel like it is very resonant to give a term to all of the ways in which creatures can be modified within reason.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love opportunities to do that and just make a design that encapsulates something that seems very intuitive and obvious, even though it might actually be pretty complicated under the hood. But because it has that sort of great resonance, it can be done very simply. And from a practical play perspective, it just ties together a lot of things that people that are doing certain kinds of decks already want to do. You know, if you have your Power Matters deck where you're trying to manipulate the power to let your Dreadhorde Arcanist buy back something huge, you might want auras and you want equipment. So giving you more ways to sort of tie together those themes, I think is just a great thing.
Yeah, to put that another way.
Not that most people are doing that with Dreadhorde Arcanist. I know, that's just me.
I don't know. I mean, to put it another way, cards that are good with auras tend to also be good with equipment and tend to also be good with counters. And so if you have a cube where one of these things is present, it's pretty likely that some other of them are also going to be present, which means these modified cards can now act as like great bridges between different synergies and archetypes, where you have this card that isn't explicitly a +1/+1 counter card, isn't explicitly an auras matter card, isn't explicitly an equipment matters card, but it fills that role for all those different decks and all those different archetypes you may support in your cube, which I think is a boon to cube designers.
Absolutely.
I will lodge one small quibble with this, which is that for those of us that are playing cubes with cards from the full history of Magic, which is most of us, I dare say, there are going to be edge cases here where something is going to feel modified, but it's not actually modified in the rules. I'm immediately thinking about a mutate creature or something. Like, that to me has a very similar spirit to auras or equipment. That's not actually a modified creature in the rules, and I can't imagine if you're being very rigorous about making sure that your cube doesn't have any very unintuitive play patterns, you might take note of opportunities for people to think that something is modified when it is not actually.
Yeah, that's definitely going to come up, and that's, you know, obviously just a feature of how complicated Magic is, and the fact that they are continuing to try and evolve and change the game. Things are just not always going to be quite as compatible as you'd like them to be, but that's just how Magic is.
Yeah,
at the same time, we're just getting more choices. So if you want to exclude some of those new things because you don't like those edge cases, you haven't lost anything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just a thing to note about the inherent complexity of the game. I do oftentimes fantasize about a world where we go back in time.
Magic 2.0.
Right, where we just go back in time with everything that Magic R&D knows now and say, make Magic again from scratch, right? Obviously, we'd lose a lot, right? We'd lose the full history of Magic if we did that, and that would be kind of a big bummer, because part of what's great about Magic is this giant card catalog of this huge history of it. But there are so many things I would love to fix. There's actually one more in this set, which will come up later, which is a big pet peeve of mine, which I would also fix if I was going back to make Magic 2.0.
Maybe we should do an episode about Magic 2.0.
That would be a great topic, actually. I really like that episode. Write that down in your copybooks. Anything else on Modified, Anthony?
I think it's cool. I love these kinds of batching mechanics that just create more sort of bridges and ways to connect themes together.
So those two mechanics, Reconfigure and Modified, account for the only brand new flagship like named mechanics in the set. We do have a number of returning mechanics and twists on returning mechanics, and the first is Sagas. We have...
Oh, great. We took everyone's favorite mechanic and we combined it with everyone's not favorite mechanic.
He's bringing the salt. All right, so we have Sagas. They are returning. I won't read the entire rules of Sagas. I think most listeners will know. If not, you can look it up. The thing about Neon Dynasty is that every Saga in Neon Dynasty is also a double-faced card that transforms into a creature as part of the resolution of the last chapter ability. All the Sagas have a creature on the back. I think in every case it's an enchantment creature. We don't have the full spoiler yet, so I could be wrong about that. And basically, you get N number of chapters. I think it's also always 3, too, in this set. Again, we haven't seen all the cards yet, so there could be exceptions. But in the most cases, it's 3 chapters. You get those first 2 chapter abilities, and on a 3rd chapter ability, it flips into that creature. I do really like Sagas, and it's hard for me to explain why. If I'm perfectly honest with myself, I think a lot of it is that I really love the Saga frame. I think the very different aspect ratio is an opportunity for Magic artists to do stuff they could never do on regular cards. And so the art is oftentimes very compelling. And I just find Sagas great. And it's weird because normally the kinds of mechanics I love are ones that gives players lots of choice, lots of agency, modality. And Sagas are kind of like inherently not that. It's like you play this card and it does these prescriptive things in an order, and that's what it is.
I think they're just a lot of fun to read. I mean, if I say, here's a creature, it's a 3/2 for 2, it has these keywords. You're like, okay, do I want that? Maybe, maybe not. But when you read the Saga, it's like, okay, first you get to do this. What do you think? All right, how about let's add one more thing? Then you get to do this. And then you get one more, and you sort of slow roll it, and that kind of reveal. I mean, it's literally telling a nice little story about how the game is going to proceed, and that I think is really satisfying.
Playing against them, I think, is pretty fun because you're like, also all right, here are some things that are going to happen on the next couple turns. Can I, with this foreknowledge, make savvy plays to make these other chapter triggers less relevant than they would be otherwise? We've talked a lot about DFCs. It was my Cube miss of the year last year, was the overall just density of DFCs in every single set we saw last year. So I'm not thrilled that they're back for all the reasons we talked about.
They haven't left.
I say they're back, but it's true. They have never left. I'm not thrilled that they're still here, overstaying their welcome in Magic, in my opinion. A brief overview of why I think we don't love DFCs. Number one, they're really complicated. I mean, you have 2 cards worth of text, and Saga's already not the simplest card type. I mean, it's a card with multiple abilities and this inherent way that it functions, right? This like inherent baked-in ability about having to advance the chapter counters and then sacrifice it and drinking on the beginning of your first main phase instead of the beginning of upkeep, which some people don't think is very intuitive. So Sagas are already kind of complicated, and now we're stapling a whole other thing on the back of it. And then there's just the practical challenge of if you're drafting with somebody that doesn't know what the back of the card does and the cards are sleeved, then they're going to have to pull that card out of its sleeve to look at the back to make a fully informed draft decision, which for those of us that are designing cubes, we want to be approachable to less enfranchised players, can be a big hurdle. All that said, I don't hate these cards, and here's why. We talked about how much I like Sagas. I still like Sagas. I still think it's cool that they're back. They're double-face cards, but they're double-face cards where the back face, much like Disturb or something, is kind of gravy in the sense that it is always going to happen at a certain chapter level. You don't have any control over when it happens, so it's just like a thing you're going to get. And then you can see on the front side the power and toughness of that back creature, which I think is really important, which at least gives you some baseline idea of what that back is going to do. So it's not the kind of thing where you have to be like looking at it in your hand and like reading the front and back and like going back and forth to figure out like when do I cast this. I feel like most of the time you're going to cast it when the Saga matters, and then you're going to get the creature whenever you get the creature, which I don't totally hate.
I agree. I'm definitely reacting with just coming from a place of double-face card fatigue, but if we have this sort of spectrum of how good are these designs, how well are they executed, modal double-face cards that are just, you can cast either side at any time, you totally need to know what both sides do, and they're super complicated, that to me is the absolute worst implementation,
right.
Or
if we're
worst
talking about
application.
like the legendary double-face cards from Kaldheim or the heads of the houses from Strixhaven, like those cards, I still don't know what any of them do. They are so not resonant and so complicated and messy.
And then on the other side, a lot of the transforming double-face cards are pretty resonant, and like you're saying, there's a predictable play pattern where you can say, okay, I cast this creature and then it flips and presumably I get some bonus. It gets better. It gets some improvement. So it still sort of carries you through how to make that card evaluation decisions about what you're doing in the game. On the really, I think, positive or the least worst extreme of the spectrum, Disturb, which you mentioned, and the cards that land on the back, you can tell mostly what the card does if you've seen a Disturb card before or a land on the back card before. Those, I think, work the best. And these are definitely close to that end of the spectrum.
Somewhere in the middle, though, I agree.
Where there is a lot of complexity. I mean, if I'm honest with myself, would I like these better if they just said, go get a token after the third chapter? It wouldn't be all that different. They would just have to put more text in the front of the card. And then, honestly, people are going to not have the tokens. So in a lot of ways, this logistically is better than just having a token. So yeah, they're somewhere in between. I'm probably not going to be including them anywhere, but yeah.
I think you covered a very interesting point there, which is that I think most of them, if they had actually put the full text of what would be the token on the front of the card, it wouldn't fit. The backs of these cards, these creatures do largely have abilities. We're not talking about vanilla tokens that come into play. And I don't think all that text would fit on the front of the card, which is why they're using this technology. And they probably wouldn't have designed many cards that function like this if it could have just made a token. Because we've had sagas that make tokens on their third chapter before, and I have no problem with those, to your point. And I think the reason I have no problem with them is that the card designers are still constrained to one card space worth of text and one card space worth of complexity to fit the entire card's mechanics on. Here, as soon as you open up this Pandora's box of now we have twice the space, why not have twice the abilities? That's where these cards, I think, really don't resonate and become really hard to like remember what they do. And so we'll see. Again, we don't have all the cards yet. We'll see if some of these really are resonant. I think these could be saved for me if the actual specific designs were very flavorful, made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense for the first two abilities and the creature you got when it flipped. That would maybe make some of these playable for me, but yeah, I expect I'm going to avoid these largely because of the double-faced card fatigue.
So something else that I think does make sense, like why they included these cards and designed them the way that they did, is this is a set that largely cares about enchantments, and sagas are a fun enchantment type. If you have your saga...
The most fun enchantment type, I would argue.
And you're doing all your enchantment things, but then suddenly you lose an enchantment, you no longer get your buff on your creature, or, triggering your have at least X enchantments. That's kind of a bummer. So the fact that these turn into things which remain enchantments, actually,
but
I think
for
is
the
a
most
really
part, are
critical.
more susceptible to removal.
True.
And once they become creatures, it's like now it's a more fragile enchantment than it was prior.
It's more fragile, but it still lets you plan ahead. It's not like, I have this thing that says you get a bonus if you have an artifact and an enchantment, and I have to cast it this turn, and maybe I don't have enough mana to, otherwise I'm losing my enchantment.
That's
I think that could lead to some pretty bad play patterns. So I think that as a solution for having your enchantment stick around, it's a pretty interesting design.
If they made tokens, though, just vanilla creature tokens,
they could make
that would be
vanilla
better for
tokens that are enchantments as well.
It's just the problem that they wouldn't be able to fit all the text on it, and that's why I don't like the cards. Too much text. Too much reading.
It's really funny.
My magic.
Sometimes you're like, why is a card worded this way? And there's like, you'll see the same text written a couple different ways in different cards. And the fact is they're just like, oh, well, we could say each opponent, or we could say other player, or, a couple different ways to word this. And in some cases, they just have to choose the one that is shortest so they can actually put the words on the card.
Next up is a returning mechanic that I think a lot of players love, Anthony. This is ninjutsu. This is an activated ability that allows you to return an unblocked attacker to your hand, pay a cost, and put the creature with a ninjutsu from your hand into play tapped and attacking, as if the creature that was attacking initially is some sort of secret ninja, and then its identity is revealed when you pay the ninjutsu cost. I think this is an all-time great mechanic. Do you agree?
Yeah. I mean, I love to play with it, and I've never heard anybody not like it.
It plays in a bunch of really cool spaces, right? Like if you just look at the first level of the mechanic, this is a way most of the time to get a creature to play at a lesser cost, right? And what you're trading is bouncing a creature you control to your hand. That alone, I think, is a very interesting tempo versus value proposition. You're essentially saying, let me draw a card, that card being a creature I already have in play, get rid of one of my creatures to get this bigger creature into play at a slightly cheaper cost, and then I have to replay that creature later on. That first level, I think, already offers some very interesting decision space. And then on top of that, you have all of these cool other abilities that interact really interestingly with ninjutsu. The biggest ones are creatures with leave the battlefield or enters the battlefield triggered abilities, because now when you return them to your hand, you get to re-trigger those abilities by recasting it, or it leaves play, and then you get to cast it again, wait for it to leave play again, which is really, really cool. We see some cards in this set that have a lot of good enter the battlefield abilities, I think, to play on that ninjutsu ability. Also, things that have any kind of evasion now are evaluated differently through the lens of this has a more likelihood of being able to attack unblocked, therefore I can activate my ninjutsu ability. I also love what it does to combat in a format where ninjutsu is a thing, because it turns what are otherwise prescriptive combats, where it's like, well, obviously you do this, right? Obviously you don't block because you're winning this race right now, and that creature, trading for your creature is bad for you. It turns these combat decisions into much more nuanced ones, where the question is, okay, I wouldn't block unless maybe they have that ninjutsu card in their hand, and now I have to actually weigh that in my attacking and blocking decisions. But I think that's a lot of depth to the onboard combat, which I really appreciate.
This is not the episode to go deep on that, but it's really interesting to hear you say that, given previous discussions about how you dislike combat tricks and, feeling like you got and you couldn't really afford to play around it.
Well, here's the thing about creatures with ninjutsu. If they only had ninjutsu and you couldn't cast it as a creature, then I would feel similarly like I feel about combat tricks. Combat tricks are only good in those situations. Creatures with ninjutsu, you draw them, you just cast them. And here's the thing, whenever I edit a little conversation we've had, we refer to this like small difference in our own magic predilections pretty often. Whenever I edit the episode, I'm always like, I wish I had said this. And the thing I wish I had said is, I don't actually mind combat tricks when they're good, which is what I think a lot of my criticisms end up coming down to. Like, I got blown out by the small creature in a combat trick. I mind them mostly when they're bad, when they do nothing, which to me is a lot of the time. Creatures with ninjutsu, you can just cast them, turns out.
True. And that's actually a really interesting point in this set. I actually wrote down a bonus mechanic, big ninjutsu, where we've seen
big jitsu.
In this set, there are a couple ninjas that normally you actually pay a cheaper cost for ninjutsu because you're additionally paying the cost of returning the creature,
right?
Which makes perfect sense. But because some of these creatures have enter the battlefield effects or relevant effects when they deal damage to your opponent, some of these actually interesting have a more expensive cost. So it adds this layer of I have my 1/1 on turn 1. Do I want to just cast my ninja now? Or do I want to wait till turn 4 where I can potentially get this bigger ability, which I think is a really interesting twist on the design.
We also see a little bit of additional ninja tribal stuff popping up a little bit here, which I think makes sense. This brings me to my previously alluded to criticism. If I could go back and make Magic 2.0, I would not tie this mechanic so flavorfully to a specific creature type that means it only works on specific planes. To me, this is a very flexible mechanic that could work on all kinds of planes and all kinds of creatures, and I would love to see them print more of it. They are just hands tied in how many times they can print ninjutsu because it's got ninja right in the name, and a lot of planes just don't have ninjas on them in Magic's lore.
It's funny how some tribes can just sort of like be everywhere. Like every plane has something you could call a goblin, but I think ninjas could be made a little bit more flexible. They're not quite goblins, but anybody can be a ninja, a turtle.
I'd be surprised if they started putting ninjas on every plane. Let's just put it that way. But I would not be upset abstractly if ninjutsu was an evergreen mechanic. I think it's a very cool mechanic. I wonder if it was at much less densities if I would begin to be more bothered by the ninjutsu combat question. If it was like, oh, instead of ninjutsu being a theme of this set and my opponent's playing the ninjutsu colors, I should reasonably expect some ninjutsu cards. If instead it's like, one card if a set has ninjutsu, maybe that would irk me.
I think it would. I think it really would, and I think you would not be alone in that.
The last returning mechanic is Channel. This is another modal ability. I feel like modal effects are somewhat a theme of this set a little bit. It's an activated ability that only appears on permanent cards that allows you to discard the card and pay a cost for a one-time effect. So the flavor here is like, you've got this permanent, a land, a creature, an enchantment, whatever, that's going to have some ongoing cost if you cast it normally. If instead of that ongoing cost, you need some one-time immediate value, you can channel it for that immediate value. Obviously, I like modal mechanics, so this is something I'm excited to see more of. What do you think of Channel specifically, Anthony, in the pantheon of A or B mechanics on cards?
So I like it more than just the most simple, just you get A or B and there's no sort of flavor or anything tying it together. Split cards, basically. Because often they do sort of have some resonant tie-in between the two halves. It's, a creature that enters the battlefield and does some damage, or if you just need the damage now, you can get it for this cheaper effect. It does suffer a little bit from this mechanic could be almost anything, like almost any modal mechanic could be structured as a channel, which is a little weird. It could be kicker. I'm just going to try not to let that bother me.
Could be evoke.
It does have some weird edge cases as well with things that care about discard, which I actually think that in a lot of contexts that could be relevant and pretty cool. But yeah, I'm okay on it.
I think the bigger thing here, I agree with you. It's not my favorite way to do the modal mechanic, but I do like the fact that it does have that kind of flavor. The bigger thing here for me is that it's uncounterable. It's activating an ability, unlike casting a spell, but the channel cards we've seen so far and historically give you a spell-like ability, and that being uncounterable, I think, can lead to some really interesting and sometimes very frustrating play situations where you're like, oh, obviously I want to counter that, but I can't, even though it's basically a removal spell or basically it's a spell ability you're getting, but you are getting it in this interesting way that I can't interact with, which can be pretty frustrating.
And fairly unintuitive as well.
Definitely very unintuitive for newer players. The other thing is, it seems like the premier cards with Channel in the set are going to be these rare legendary land cycle that come into play untapped, tap for a color of mana, and then have this Channel ability on top of it. And putting the Channel ability on lands introduces even more wrinkles. I'm imagining just, duressing my opponent on turn 1 and even Thoughtseize. I can't take your land, even though it's got a spell ability stapled to it, which makes the cards a little better, but also makes them a little less interactive in ways that, again, might be unintuitive and players might not enjoy.
The other thing I could see with these Channel cards is if they were really pushed, maybe they could do something with cards like Moderation or other spells that sort of restrict spell casting.
I like the idea of building a deck around something like that, where, cycling is another mechanic that sometimes you can have triggers on cycling. There are cards that say, when you cycle me, do this thing, which is basically a spell-like effect, but cycling, much like Channel, is not actually a spell. It's a keyword ability. So it's kind of like that, right? Where you can imagine building a cycling deck or a Channel deck that does have a way to tax casting spells. I mean, this is very relevant for one of my own cubes. In the Degenerate Micro Cube, a couple of these lands are going to be very good, and one of the reasons they're going to be very good is that their ability to be channeled is not affected by any of the spheres, not affected by Thalia, not affected by any of the stacks effects. You just get that effect. I can't slow you down or keep you from doing that. I can name it with Sorcerer's Spyglass, though.
Right.
So just a different kind of interaction. You have to think about all the different layers of potential interaction you can have. let's talk about some unnamed mechanics, Anthony, because as you mentioned at the beginning, I think they designed the set, and in design, they probably have all the mechanics kind of named with design playtesting names, and it seems clear that some of the mechanics get kind of pared down and they lose their keyword, but there's still this consistent rules text that is applied on multiple cards across the set. And one of them is this like pilot mechanic where we have creatures and creature tokens in some cases that can crew vehicles as if they were larger. What do you think of pilots, Anthony?
I think that's very cool. I think it's just another little effect that allows you to add some incremental value, make a small thing that is more valuable, but you do have to build around it in a way. And I like mechanics like that.
Yeah, to me, this mostly feels like a way to print more vehicles into the set without danger of making them too pushed for environments outside of this specific standard and limited environment.
In limited, you have like a really good plan for how you're going to crew your big vehicle, but it's not going to be, maybe those pilot cards just aren't going to have that same impact in constructed formats.
Right, you can't just drop them into, or even the vehicles themselves. I'm saying specifically the vehicles, I think. I've seen a lot more Crew 3 on cards that I think are going to be playable in Kamigawa Limited and perhaps even in Standard, whereas Crew 3 is normally a really big hurdle to jump through that you wouldn't expect people to be able to get to do, and they're not going to be able to just drop them into some random Modern or Pioneer deck and have them work, because I think the viability of a lot of the crew costs in this set on the vehicles is somewhat contingent upon a density of these pilot-style effects. But like you said, it's a pretty minimal effect. Like, for example, we've seen a Savannah line, a 1-mana 2/1 that crews up, which I think is a cool ability where the floor is very good if you're playing an aggressive deck, right? We've talked a lot about how many decks are happy to have a 1-mana 2/1 in the history of Cube and Constructed and Standard. And here we have that variant, which has a little bit of upside, where now you have a 1-mana creature that can crew 4 worth of power on a vehicle, which is pretty insane.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just a very flavorful thing. The fact that power is exactly tied to how well you can crew something, it's a little, from a flavor perspective,
definitely
doesn't
a little
make perfect
shaky.
sense. So having this sort of like new design space of, hey, we can, and we've actually seen this with, the Chariot in Crimson Vow and a couple other cards that have these alternate ways to crew. So I really enjoy seeing them explore that space of alternate crewing.
What's the alternate crewing Chariot in Crimson Vow?
I believe you just tap 2 creatures because it's the wedding chariot.
Oh, right, you're right. Thank you. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Yeah, I like that Chariot a lot flavorfully, and I think these pilots work flavorfully as well. And like we said, this could have been a named mechanic. It's possible that in design they had pilot as a mechanic, and then they were like, actually, we don't want as many of these cards as we thought, and we care more about focusing attention on reconfigure and modified, so let's just keep some of these cards as designed, but not keyword them.
Right.
Which is what might have happened behind the doors at R&D.
I think there's going to be rare that you have a density of vehicles, that's something that you're looking for, but I think that these are just having more cards like this opens up the possibility for unique novel cubes where you might be doing that.
I was going to say, if there was ever a set to possibly make a vehicle-themed cube possible, I think it would be this set.
Absolutely.
Even more so than like Kaladesh, which introduced vehicles for the first time. Now we have enough density of them. They've been around and been deciduous in Magic's history for the past 4 or 5 years or whatever. And now we're getting these different takes on them, which I think commit to them more as a theme. So if you were trying to make a Vehicles Matter cube or put a Vehicles Matter theme in your cube, I think this is your time to shine.
Do it. I want to see it.
One other mechanic that is returning but wasn't mentioned in the article, this is actually a named mechanic, is Shrines. So Shrines are this class of cards. Historically, they've always been enchantments, and enchantments that have some triggered ability that does something n number of times, where n is the number of shrines you control, and they're on actual shrines themselves. So as a baseline, the card does the thing once every turn, and when you start collecting shrines, adding more of them to your deck, you can basically make that ability grow while adding other effects to that ability. And we're for the first time now, Anthony, seeing shrines as creatures enchantments as well in this set, which I think is going to be very, very cool to a very specific set of Magic players who are going to be really excited to see these shrine creatures.
Yeah, I find shrines to be super resonant and exciting. It's like, oh, these legendary things that you can't just put like a bunch of the same one and get this repetitive effect. You need to build a variety of them, and you get to sort of build this big contraption that does all kinds of stuff. Like, that sounds really appealing and exciting. You can also phrase it as, oh yeah, it's a bunch of disparate effects that don't really, make sense together, and it just snowballs and is super repetitive, and you don't really have a lot of agency. So I think that shrines are actually not my favorite mechanic to play a lot of. Like, I think to have it every once in a while in a limited experience, to get that feeling of I'm assembling the Shrine Voltron is cool. For most cubes, it's probably not what I'm looking for and interested in.
Yeah, shrines are not my favorite play pattern. Enchantments are historically one of the most difficult to interact with card types in Magic, And this idea of just building up a collection of them that creates these repetitive triggers that just get bigger and bigger is not what I am into about Magic. But like I said, I think there are certain players out there for whom these are very resonant, and they are very excited to build this, like, it's kind of like Voltron, but for yourself. I imagine it's like, instead of putting a bunch of equipments and auras on a creature, you're just putting a bunch of these shrines all around yourself and building this big fort of triggered abilities to take over the game.
Right, and even if it's not what I'm most interested in, I appreciate just having this completely different angle that you can play the game at and having that be available for other people. Like, it's cool to see that diversity, that you can just play Magic in totally different ways.
Absolutely.
Something that's really weird about these shrines, though, is, like you said, they are creatures, but we talked about the text constraint. They couldn't fit a creature type on these shrines. They're just legendary enchantment creature shrines. No creature type, which is maybe you're playing around Plague Engineer.
Because shrines is an enchantment type, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was interesting. Yeah, no creature type at all.
Huh. Neat.
What will we see next? I wonder what sort of code in somebody's Magic project that will break. Empty strings for the creature type, which is something I never expected.
Recently, there was some way you can generate a typeless, not subtype, but a typeless permanent through some combination of...
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
One of those bad MTG combos. Have you seen the bad MTG combo that allows you to tear all Magic cards in existence to shreds?
I love that one. That's a really good one.
It's a pretty good one.
My favorite part of that is where you have to, bind Mark Rosewater into a contract because he's the only one who can make rulings on uncards. So if he is allowed to make rulings, it breaks the combo.
Yep. You got to just like lock him up in a stored container in the middle of the desert or something.
There's apparently a card that lets you do that. So.
All right. The last unnamed mechanic I have listed here is what I'm going to call Samurai Exalted. We have a series of Samurai cards in the set that care about when a Samurai you control attacks alone, some ability triggers. As far as I can tell, these are all on Samurais, which makes a lot of sense. They basically have an ability that triggers when they attack, or if you have another Samurai attacking alone, you can possibly get 2 of these triggers, which is similar to Exalted.
Yeah, it's actually Samurai or Warrior. So like you're saying with the
long tail of Magic history.
The dangerous word here. I'm not going to use the dangerous word.
Don't use it. I'll bleep it. I swear to God, I'll bleep it.
A little bit narrow. So it's nice they threw in Warrior here to say like, yeah, Samurais are basically just like the warriors of this world. So this interacts with warriors in other worlds as well, which is nice. I really enjoy Exalted. It's just a really fun mechanic.
Love it.
Again, having this mechanic that just sort of rewards you for making interesting decisions in combat. It also obviously is just another great way to support this sort of like modified mechanic of, well, I do want to use this reconfigure effect and put all my enchantments on this one creature because I get rewarded for attacking with just my one big warrior.
I wouldn't even say it rewards you for making interesting decisions, but it changes combat from, again, being deterministic. Deterministic is the word I wanted earlier.
Deterministic.
It changes combat from being deterministic, where it's like, given this board state, I obviously attack with everything, to being, well, actually...
You have multiple options.
Because I have Samurai Exalted, now I have these 2 equally good options to choose from, or seemingly equally good. I, as a player, get to use all of my wit to decide which of those options is actually better given my long-term game plan and all the hidden information I have. It plays out really nicely. I think part of what makes actual Exalted good is how surprisingly good +1 to power and toughness is in a lot of board states, where what would otherwise be an attack that would cause a trade is now an attack that would cause a double block and trade, or an attack that would cause a chump. So here I'm wondering how many of these triggered abilities are going to be good enough to be worth holding back, because we can like this mechanic in the abstract, but if the actual literal payoffs are not good enough to be worth attacking alone, then it might as well not even be a mechanic, right? It has to actually be worth holding back other attackers.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're really talking abstractly about the way that these mechanics work. Obviously, they could say whenever a samurai attacks alone, you lose the game. And that would not be a great card you'd be excited to play.
Yeah, unless.
Send
that to the bad MPG combo people. They will figure something out about that.
That's got to be easy to break, right?
You donate it to your opponent and you tap your Goblin Diplomats and you say they must attack.
But they can only attack with that one thing, so you have to plague with them first.
You got to kill everything else.
Perfect.
We can make it happen. We sped run through this, and I'm very proud of us.
I think we did a solid job. I'm really excited about this set. I think compared to the couple sets previous, very often the sort of set mechanics, the
flagship mechanics.
Yeah, very often the sort of flagship mechanics for a set are fairly narrow. They ask you to just play a bunch of that mechanic together, and so in a lot of cubes, you're not that interested in them unless you're really saying, like, that's a theme I like, and I want to sort of take it wholesale and emphasize it. Whereas I think all of these sort of modification and equipment and enchantment matters and artifacts matters. And channel is obviously really flexible too. I think a lot of these mechanics are just going to be really flexible in terms of the kinds of environments that they fit in. So I think for Cube specifically, this is I'm very optimistic about finding some interesting cards here.
Yeah, I agree. Most of these mechanics work very well standing on their own. You don't have to have them supported in any specific way. The only one I think doesn't really is modified, but as we talked about, that fits into many different kinds of environments instead of just one kind of environment.
Right. I mean, it is more narrow, but it is more backwards compatible with a ton of other cards than many mechanics.
Yeah, there are a lot of cubes that just have a Boggles theme that are just going to drop in Boggles? They're just going to drop in some of these modified cards right into their Voltron or Boggles theme or Enchantress theme and be very happy with it. So to me, that's a great example of executing a synergistic mechanic. Like Modified does care about having more of a something, right? It is kind of snowballing. You want more of the same kind of effect in your deck, but they've done it in a way that it is not narrowing. It is more open-ended and backwards compatible, which I appreciate. And the rest of the mechanics are just kind of strong standalone mechanics, which is great for most of us who are working with all of Magic's history at our fingertips when we're designing our cubes and battle boxes.
It's a huge and very cool shift in evolution of what, from a mechanical perspective, was not a great plane previously. Great job, Wizards.
Maybe they'll give us more Kamigawa sooner if this set is well received. I was hoping we would get to do our kitchen tier list, Anthony, which we've been teasing for a couple weeks here, but I have messed up my timing and forgotten I have another obligation soon, so I don't have time today.
Well,
so
I don't have a tier list, so
you still haven't made it? I assigned you homework.
Do you want to do this tier list, or do you want to make me get angry about what a bad exercise it is?
I think you need to embrace the idea of giving things rankings a little more. You and I are on the exact same page about why it has problematic features. I feel like you don't accept any of the benefits that it has.
Correct.
It's going to lead us to have conversations we would never otherwise have. The alternative is, hey, let's just sit down and list everything in the kitchen and say what we think about it and hope that people can then listen to that, digest it clearly, and understand the entire conversation. This is a prompt. It's a prompt for us. I'm asking you, what are the most important things in your kitchen? What are the next most important things?
Okay, that's a more reasonable prompt.
That's the same prompt.
Well,
S tier,
I
most important
listening.
things in your kitchen. A tier, slightly less but still very important things in your kitchen. B tier, things that are nice to have, but not that important. C tier, stuff that maybe you have around because you have a very well-stocked kitchen, but you wouldn't describe as important to anybody. D tier, stuff maybe you actively dislike and avoid.
I'm going to write that down. Could you give me one more time slowly?
You can listen to this episode when it comes back out and listen to it then to get that list. That's all it is, man. People like this stuff. It's more digestible. You can't trust everybody to listen to every single word we say and do all that mental processing to put these into these categories.
I wouldn't trust anyone or ask anyone to do that.
But that's what we're gonna do it at some point. Anthony,
I mean, listen to us at all.
Sure,
much.
Yeah, no, of course. No, I don't trust anybody to listen to us. If you're out there listening to us, I'm very sorry. Anyway,
and on that bombshell,
I have to go. I got stuff to do. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Anthony and I having a little bit of caffeine, me being on a little bit of a time crunch unexpectedly, and sitting in Anthony's basement talking about all the new stuff from the new set really, really fast. Thanks for doing that, Anthony.
Thanks, Eddie.
Here we go. Great.
Beep, boop.